One of the things is, Terry, I wanted to talk to you about Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, and it's such a remarkable book. It's big, it's confusing, it's in an unusual order, and there's a big distance between text and interpretation. So, like, I find this with my students. You probably find the same. But when I read you and I read Robert Pippin, and students read Stephen Houlgate and so on, they like Hegel. They go, oh, this is super interesting. But when they get to the text itself, they go, oh, good heavens, this is a different kettle of fish entirely. So I just wanted to ask you generally, how would you describe Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit to, say, someone encountering it for the very first time? Which you do, I know, with your students. But I just want to hear what you say about it.
It's a strange book that just draws people in. What I have found is that even though people often say, I have no idea what's going on, nonetheless, they also say, this is a really fascinating book. I really have to figure out what's going on here. So one of the things about this is that Hegel himself, of course, wasn't sure, as he was writing the book, what he was going to be doing. Eckhard Förster has, I think, pretty well shown that he changed his mind really halfway through the book. He had a contract with the publisher. The publisher was supposed to pay him a certain amount once he had finished half the book, or more than half the book. Right? And so Hegel basically wrote the first part of the book. He got all the way up to, more or less, virtue in the way of the world. And then he realized that although he wrote the last chapter, something called Die Wissenschaft, Science, Part C, and he realized, oh, that's not the book I'm writing. I'm writing another book. Right? And so it was a huge kerfuffle. The publisher said, what do you mean? I'm never going to, I'm going to call the whole thing off. His friend Emanuel Niethammer had to promise to buy all the copies of Hegel.
What a pal.
Right. And so what happened was that Hegel two things happened. First, I think, has drawn this out very clearly and so on, just in terms of counting the number of folio pages and so on, is that Hegel was teaching a course on the history of philosophy. And he also read Goethe's Metamorphosis of Plants, about how things change their form and can keep their identity intact, right? Move through time and so on. And he put those two together and he said, oh, that's what I'm doing. Right? This isn't, in fact, a book about just the science of the experience of consciousness, which is what its original title was. It's something else. It's a phenomenology of Geist, spirit, mind. So you get this, kind of highly philosophical, dialectical book that suddenly turns into this book about the philosophy of history, and then it becomes a philosophy of religion, and so on. And then it ends with this dramatic, misquote of the Schiller poem, and so on.
As well as all that, there was turbulent times. It was turbulent times when the book was produced. Quickly, it was not that long in the aftermath of the French Revolution, 1789, in Jena. It was a very sort of a thriving little town between sort of 1790 and 1806. I think it was 1801. Correct me if I'm wrong, Terry. I think it was around 1800, 1801 that Hegel arrived, but. He famously shares a room with Hölderlin in Schelling. But also in the town, we have, as you mentioned, Goethe, but there's also Novalis, there's Schiller, the Schlegels are knocking about, the von Humboldts are there, and of course Fichte. And Kant is not a million miles away as well, I suppose, or at least geographically perhaps. But I was thinking, like, of all of that sort of mix, who was Hegel responding to there? What were the contributing ideas that went into the formation of the Phenomenology of Spirit? I thought that would be a useful thing to talk about before I eventually get you to explain at the end what Geist actually means.
One of the things that had happened was the just kind of explosive effect that Kant had. I mean, Kant wrote the Critique of Pure Reason. Nothing much happened, but then a few years after that book appeared, it just took Germany by storm. And of course, people in France and around and so on were hearing about this. Right? And there were lots of people that were interested in this. I mean, here's a little odd story for you, right? Later President of the United States, John Quincy Adams, who was the son of John Adams, who was the second president, he in fact went to Germany to study Fichte and all this other stuff.
Oh, I did not know that.
So he was writing letters to his father, President of the United States, about what he was hearing about Fichte and about Kant and so on and so on. He actually wasn't that impressed. There was an Englishman, Crab Robinson, right, who wrote a book about his travels through Jena and talking to people like Schelling and so on and so on. So this was clearly in the air. Right? Jena, which was a complete and total backwater, had suddenly transformed under the leadership of this kind of great, poet, scholar, scientist, bureaucratic functionary, Goethe, right, who was the sole minister for the prince that was in charge of the university. He declared it to be basically a place where academic freedom would now reign. So people were just pouring into Jena, right? Then Fichte had then taken up the Kantian challenge, and so on. Let me back up just a bit. Actually, Reinhold, right, had taken this up. Reinhold, a former Jesuit who converted to Protestantism. Reinhold published in 1781, 1785, right, the letters on the Kantian philosophy, in which he said, Kant has solved the big problem of our time. He's actually solved it. And that's the relation between religion and science. Here, Kant has shown that science describes the world as it really is, but the world as it is in itself really requires faith in things like this and so on. Now, in the kind of religious atmosphere that Germany was in the time, right, this was another just little bomb that exploded, right? So Kant has solved it. And Reynolds said, but the problem is that nobody quite understands how all the parts of Kant's philosophy fit. So we need to put the whole thing into order. And this creates not just a kind of research program for philosophy professors. It's actually a cultural event. We have to figure out what Kant is telling us. Reinhold writes a book on this. There's some problems with it. Reinhold leaves. He's replaced by Fichte. Fichte is driven out on trumped-up charges of atheism. Schelling takes over, and so on. Right? So this is a growing kind of, and so it's a hothouse in which a lot of people feel that there's a lot at stake existentially. There's the French Revolution that's occurred. There is the reaction from the German princes, right, to invade France and stop the revolution. That's turned back at Valmy in 1792. Then there's the collapse of the Revolution in the Terra. Then there's the replacement of it with the Directory. Then finally Napoleon takes charge. So there's a new world that's dawning. Right? Everybody can see this around them. A lot of people are terrified of it. A lot of people are cheering it on. It's in that context that Hegel is now writing. So he's throwing his hat in the ring. I'm going to be one of those people talking about what this is all about. Now, it's very striking that from 1801 to 1807, Hegel doesn't produce that much. I mean, he produces, a little essay that we all read now in retrospect is brilliant. These are events between Kant and Fichte's philosophy. He writes an essay on natural law and so on. He writes a whole bunch he writes several books that he doesn't publish. He writes them, decides they're not good enough, puts them away. Luckily, he saved them. He saved the manuscript, so we can now go back and reconstruct his path there. But Hegel is a good example for anyone who despairs at a certain point in their life of going anywhere. I mean, Hegel's in his 30s. He has no paying job. He has a small inheritance from his father that's rapidly running out. He's in big trouble with his landlady, who's now got his little legitimate child. And the Napoleonic Wars have come to Jena and to Germany, right? So this is a guy with just no future. And he sits down in 1 year, really. It really takes about a year, about 1806. Maybe he might have started in 1805. This is just disputed, right? About 1 year, he writes. This book is essentially a first draft.
Explains a lot.
He's figuring it out as he goes along. And when it's over, the university is pretty well closed. He has no job. He has to become a newspaper editor. His friend Daytimer gets him that job and so on. He later becomes a high school teacher and also in charge of all philosophy in all of the newly reconstituted Bavarian state and so on. So this is a guy who really was looking into the abyss at the time when he was writing the Phenomenology here. And he produced a work of just incredible genius. So it has to be read in the background of that. And there's a huge amount of cultural effervescence going on, which is the revolution has occurred. What are we going to do? We're going to go backwards. We're going to go forwards. What does it mean? Is Kant right that we've solved the problem, right, about religion and science and so on? And what is this new world going to look like? That's the questions Hegel's asking.
Now, one of the things talking about religion and talking about science, or the place of science in the picture of humanity, the place of religion in the picture of humanity, in this very critical juncture in the early 1800s, these things were very much up for grabs. And I think that Hegel's The Phenomenology of Spirit is in some sense articulating that sort of temporal juncture, that sort of is sort of historical indeterminacy, which is, if you were living it, is probably a lot different to how we look back at it now. But that brings me to one of the points that you make in your book on the Phenomenology of Spirit. You say, and I'm going to quote you here, Terry, I said, to my mind, the classic mistake in Hegel interpretation lies in the inference from the unity of Geist and in its explanatory place to the claim that Geist must therefore be a substance thing of some sort, a cosmic spirit. Could you expand on that a little bit? Because Hegel started as a theological student at Tübingen, I think it was, in did he become disenchanted with theology, or did he try to reform theology? And I mean, or is it like a kind of Aristotelian naturalism that he's tried to bring about in this Phenomenology of Spirit?
Well, I mean, he was a theology student, very clear about it. He was studying for the priesthood. In fact, it was really not until fairly late in his career that he didn't have to continually get permission from the Württemberg Theological group as to what jobs he could accept and he didn't accept, or whether he could be just reappointed and to be a minister in some little provincial town or something. So theology is really at the heart of what Hegel's doing. Hegel's reactions to that is, his 20s and 30s are up and down, but he pretty well by his 30s has come down to the idea that religion is crucial. Now, question, what did he end up meaning by religion? This is where the Hegelian school, after his death in 1831, where it broke apart, it's still one of the great dividing lines in Hegel scholarship. So people have concluded, right, that Geist is, as the same thing, progressing through history, as we see in the second part of this part on spirit and the phenomenology of spirit. And since it is the same thing, it must be therefore some type of substance in this case. Now, first of all, when Hegel uses the term Geist, he uses it as a general term, right? In the sense that we talk of the wolf or the whale. The whale typically lives in the ocean. The wolf typically hunts in packs and so on. Now, we don't think there's anything called a substance called wolfiness or whaliness that is existing out there, right? There are lots of individual wolves and lots of individual whales, and they have things that structure what they are and what they do. And that's the sense when Hegel talks about der Geist, the spirit, the mind, right? That's the sense in which he's using that here. And when I said that I think the crucial mistake has always been to say that since there is something called Geist developing itself, it must therefore be a substance of some sort. But again, the wolf has evolved, so has the whale, so have we. Right? But there's not a substance out there that's evolving. There is a unity of something out there. Now, what I propose, I realize now this is a bit controversial, right? Is that we render Geist better if we think of it as simply self-conscious life. And so Hegel is writing a book about the phenomenology of self-conscious life.
Right. In
fact, I think here's just as a little test. You can try this out. Just anytime you run across a mention of Geist in Hegel's works, just substitute the phrase self-conscious life and see if it makes any difference to what you're doing.
That's a good tip, Terry. I will try that.
Yeah, it always works with one possible exception. And that's where Hegel talks about self-conscious life. A self-conscious Geist. And I think that means self-conscious life. That can't be right. But when he talks about self-conscious Geist, he's just talking about self-conscious life as it is now fully becoming conscious that it is self-conscious life and not something else. I'd not either say just a merely naturalistic occurrence, right? Or a kind of cosmic spirit of some sort and so on.
Now, one of the things that I think complements that point is that there must be scientific developments contributing to this. So you mentioned evolution, but he's pre-evolution, or I suppose pre-Lamarck, I guess. But I'm thinking there's obviously Newton is in the background, as he's for everyone, I guess. But there's also Leibniz, because one of the early chapters is famously on force. One of the opening chapters of the Phenomenology of Spirit is one of the chapters I personally, at least, I find fascinating, and it's very difficult and it's very elliptical. It's very hard to grasp what he's trying to do. But what you said there about substance seems to be at stake there. That is what the truth of nature is that it's not a thing or an object, as you said, but a force, or that the reality of the world is force itself. and us trying to come to understand how we are the expression of that force. I think that is also a contributing factor on the sort of on the more scientific background to the phenomenology of spirit.
Well, one of the things that is about the background on force and so on has to do with Kant's Anfangsgründe, right, the Naturwissenschaft, metaphysics of natural science here, where Kant had argued that, you have all the Newtonian forces, gravity and so on, that we're talking about. But now, philosophically speaking, a priori, there must be at least two forces, Kant said. There has to be a force of attraction and a force of repulsion. If we only had attraction, everything would just collapse into a little ball. If we only had repulsion, the universe would just scatter. So we need both those together. Now, that's an a priori claim about what kinds of forces there are. Now, people like Schelling picked that up and said, well, right, if there's an a priori claim about attraction and repulsion, maybe we can also talk about some other forces, such as electromagnetism, right, and so on, right, and, actually electricity and magnetism. That's Schelling. Electromagnetism as a unified theory came a bit later. So, and that section on force is really about what Geist is doing when it's postulating all these kinds of forces, and especially whether or not there is, not following Schelling, whether there is an a priori ground for postulating all these different types of forces. And he's tracing out the dialectic of that, how that just goes around in circles, it kind of contradicts itself, and so on, and so on, and so on, and so on. And the crucial move then occurs, right, very late in the section on force, when Hegel says, at this point, right, you really understand that you have to grasp the world as a whole. You have to learn to see the world as a whole. And that is when self-consciousness enters. So when we see the world as a whole, we see it as the unconditioned, as infinite. And this is where the first time in the book, outside of the preface and the introduction, where the term self-consciousness occurs. And so self-consciousness is this knowing, not merely knowing things, consciousness, but now you realize that you know, you become self-conscious. And Hegel's wonderful phrase for this is the difference that is no difference.
Wow.
They are distinct, they're distinct conceptually and semantically, you might say, right? I know something, I know that I know it too. But there's no debate in analytic philosophy about this, right? Is that really true? Is there really any difference? Are they really just saying the same thing, right? Looks like they're different, but they're not. Hegel's view is they are different. It's the difference that is no difference.
Right, because you can be both a sort of sentient being and a being that questions that sentience, which is what he's tried to articulate as substance. And that's what he's doing in the early stages of the Phenomenology of Spirit. So for listeners, he's at the opening passages of the Phenomenology of Spirit, or the opening chapters, he talks about this thing called sense certainty, perception, force and understanding, and then he moves on to the famous parts about the master-slave dialectic. Well, I guess that's the question then. Why is that progression necessary then from sense certainty to perception, force and understanding to the master slave? Because then he's starting to fill out that picture of the self that's self-conscious, or the consciousness that is self-conscious, I guess. Yeah.
Well, one of the things that's going on in the consciousness chapter is that Hegel is, first of all, he's just taking on to some old philosophical problems, right? About perception and understanding and so on and so on. That's true. There's also, again, a cultural background to this. That is, there's lots of people that are saying, basically, these are terrible times. We don't actually need that much thought. What we need is just to kind of focus on what we're immediately aware of and so on and so on. Remember, Schleiermacher had written a great book on philosophy of religion called On Religion and Its Culture Despisers, where he says, look, the fact is that religion is this intuition of the infinite. It's just that you just see it. It's not articulable. You can't conceptually articulate it. It has lots of different ways it's been articulated historically through all the different world religions, but it's just there, and it's more grasped in feeling and directness. Now, if there's anything that Hegel was more or less opposed to, it was the idea that something is grasped directly that isn't mediated by anything else. And so Hegel breaks this down in the beginning of the book by saying, is there anything I can know without having to know anything else? That's what this kind of immediacy would be. And lots of people say, I know that God loves me. I know that there's a book in front of me. I know that it's day and not night. Well, actually, you don't know those things without knowing anything else. Those things are all mediated by other things. And it starts going from there until finally you get, very rapidly you're into this discussion of, well, you might say, not so much scientific as natur philosophical, right? I'd say natur philosophie. There is something that Schelling has invented here at this point. It's called natur philosophie. It's not philosophie der Natur. It's not philosophy of nature. It is natural philosophy here, or nature philosophy, as you like, the way nature itself is philosophizing about itself. And that involves nature, as it were, developing all these forces for itself and this and that. And that's where Hegel is coming into this. So there's, again, a kind of religious and philosophical and cultural, background to this, right? What do I know, right? And it turns out that that question leads to, when do I know that I know, and not just glibly or falsely believing that I know something here. And that's when self-consciousness enters. There's a nice little passage in Hegel's lectures on the history of philosophy. He said, when this self-consciousness enters, right, this very peculiar relation to yourself is the difference, there's no difference. So no new content is added, right? And yet all of world history turns on this difference. As soon as that element of self-consciousness enters, and you might say as soon as that element of self-consciousness enters, we also get a kind of new dynamic. We get a new tension, that is. What we'd like to be is very highly self-conscious, right, about things, right? Not to be people say, be a little bit like the marionettes in the marionette theater, right? So what we want is we want to be completely absorbed in what we're doing so that we're not thinking about what we're doing. We also want to be self-consciously completely absorbed. That's what we can't do. That little difference is always there, even, when you're throwing a ball, right, at a target, you are self-consciously doing something. You're taking aim, right? And a lot of it looks like you're just gliding without thinking, but in fact, this is a mode of thinking.
And that makes sense because so that would be, we've all these dispositions and habits and instincts which are all untaught. I mean, that's what sort of sincerity is these natural assumptions we have about the world that we think it's there and it exists. But in some sense, we get to the point where we are we end up having a little bit of dissatisfaction that we can't be both self-conscious and sort of natural desiring beings at one and the same time. That's the thought, isn't it?
Well, I mean, that's really key in a lot of ways to what Hegel is doing. And one of the things is, he develops this in later on after the self-consciousness chapter itself. I mean, he really starts talking about what it is to now think of yourself as a self-conscious life in terms of the chapter on reason, where we really now then actually go into scientific discoveries as opposed to the Naturphilosophie that we're talking about in chapter 3, right, or part 3, right, of this consciousness chapter, Forcing the Understanding. There you have the idea that, that it's a mistake to separate our intentions, let's say, from our embodied existence, from our life existence. Yeah. And, is it the difference between me and, say, Ronaldo, right? Is that Ronaldo and I both were playing soccer. We both have the same intention. I intend to dribble the ball down. I intend to take the ball all the way down to the goal and shoot, right? It's just that Ronaldo does it better, right? And, Donald Davidson famous, what his view was is you form an intention that can be stated clearly, and then you put it into action, and then nature takes over. When nature takes over, Ronaldo scores, and I fall over on my face as I'm trying to, go down the field and so on. Actually, Ronaldo and I are forming different intentions, as it were, concretely speaking. Ronaldo sees the field out there. He sees all the kind of forces and everything. He knows what his body can do. I don't see that. I just see a ball I'm supposed to be trying to kick at best. I see.
It's interesting because he's talking about, and science is developing in this point, and there's new discoveries happening, and sort of electromagnetism, as you alluded to. But in some sense, I think Hegel has said is that it's not that we're not natural beings or sensuous beings. We sure are, but we're not determined as such. So what he's articulating as he goes through the Phenomenology of Spirit, as he goes through those early chapters, through the Master and Slave dialectic, he's trying to talk about how the human being is essentially, as you point out, an active being, or a form of activity, like Ronaldo, or it's a form of self-expression or self-realization of what we are at one and the same time. So, and I think this is one of the things you talk about in the book, that what distinguishes the human being as a natural and sensuous being, and we account for those things, is this sort of distinction between internal and external purposes. So an external purpose, I think the example you give in the book is like a clock made by a human being. So the clock is made by something external to it, which gives it its motion. But organisms have internal purposes. So they are self-relating. or they set their own ends, I think is probably the best way to put it, which is sort of a big theme in your work to a greater or lesser degree.
Well, I mean, organisms, you might say, they have their own ends, but they don't really set their own ends. That is, the ends they have as the kinds of creatures that they are. Right? So rabbits don't set the end of eating lettuce. Right? They just eat lettuce because that's what rabbits do. Foxes don't set the end of eating rabbits. It's just that's one of the things foxes do here. And we are like that, except that we make ourselves into a moving target. That is, we are acting in terms of what we are as a form of life. Self-conscious form of life means that we are setting ends, and we're changing those ends as the circumstances and so on in which we're using them fall apart and don't work anymore, and we then start looking for how we are going to go about in this new area where we are now setting ends in light of the failures of what we've done in the past. So we're a very peculiar, I might say, species. Right? The other species just do what they do as the species that they are. We're a species that do what we does that makes ourselves into a moving target. We're just forever shape-shifting, as it were. You know, we're medievals, and then we're early moderns, and then we're revolutionaries, and then we're bourgeois, and then we're this and we're that.
Isn't that then, I suppose that's why, and I probably should have started at the beginning with this, so, that's why the term dialectic is probably appropriate to the phenomenology of spirit, because it's the holding of, well, yeah, so dialectic means between two tongues, roughly, it's the holding of tensions together. It's about the unity of tensions, I think. Isn't that probably the most simplistic, way of putting it? But that's kind of what he's trying to grasp at it there, which fills out that picture of all of the the different sort of moving targets and contradictions that we are.
But one of the great metaphors that Hegel uses throughout his philosophy is the metaphor of the organism. Of course, this is something he also picks up from Schelling and so on early on, right? That we're not just a mechanical, we're not like watches and robots, right? We are organisms. And organisms act in terms of the whole which they are, right? All the organs of a cat cooperate in their catness and so on to keep the cat as an organism alive. One of the ways of thinking about dialectic is something like the following, although this is, you might say, jumping ahead in the book a lot here, is that in a particular Gestalt des Lebens, a form of life, there are lots of tensions that are at work. Typically for people in that form of life, those are seen as simply something like, let's say, competing goals or competing goods. They have to be balanced off against each other. So you might think, well, there's individuals and there's society. Well, you have to have room for the individual and you have to have room for society. If you go too far on one side, and so on, so on, so on. But there's always the danger that these tensions can fall apart. That is, the tensions aren't really just tensions, they're actually contradictions. And when they become seen as the contradictions that they are, for various types of reasons, when they become seen as the contradictions that they are, that's when now to take the metaphor of the organism gets sick and falls apart. Here. Its parts are pulling in different directions. Now what happens is it shapeshifts into another form of organism. Greece kind of falls apart and gets absorbed by Rome that takes over large parts of Greece and so on and so on. And that's more or less that's something like that is I take it what's going on in the kind of dialectic finding the phenomenology. Things that look like just tensions between things that we were trying to balance off against each other turn into actual, or rather expose themselves as contradictions. Now, that can go on for a long time. It can go on in science for a long time. It can go on in political life for a long time. But when, for whatever reason, say in political life, when some group starts exploiting the tensions, right, push its own aims out, at that point, then not merely the tension-filled balancing act comes into view, is made clear, but rather the fact that this is a set of contradictions at work becomes more clear. And people basically lose their faith. They lose their normative allegiance to that particular way of doing things. At a certain point, people just quit believing in the Western Empire. They can't, it's just not working. It can't hold itself together, and so on and so on. All the virtues that we thought it had turns out actually are contradictions deep at work in the nature of Rome. And so it's deep sigh, time to go on and do something else.
What's interesting about that is that Hegel is the dialect or the phenomenology of spirit is, and it does talk about these historical trends as well as all of the things that we've been talking about to this point. Like the phenomenology of spirit is a very full book, Terry. Just let me put it to you that way. There's a lot going on.
But I mean, actually, looking at the events of the last week, as you and I are talking here, right? With the kind of
Tariff war.
Well, yeah, 2 days ago, it looked like the world economy was just going to explode and be set on fire by this idiot that we have as president. Never mind, calling it off. Who knows? He may call it back on later on this afternoon. But of course, one of the things that's interesting about that is there are lots of ways in which Western Europe and the United States have been balancing various tensions off between free market capitalism, its commitment to equality, so-called democracy, the rule by experts, so on the rise of the so-called populists, right? And of course, what I've been thinking about the last week is, are we at this point where things that we thought we had balanced out are now turning out to be contradictions, right? And becoming more clearly seen as contradictions, in which case people start losing faith. And we're in the middle of that right now.
This was the question, Terry, that I was going to end the debate on. I was like, you're always in these podcast discussions, what's the relevance of Hegel today? But you're actually going, we're in the middle of a phenomenology. Does that mean that there's a Napoleon in a couple of years' time? I'm worried about to arrive.
That's a good question, right? I mean, do we have to worry really about a Napoleon? Well, we might. I mean, Donald Trump is certainly not Napoleon, right? But he is an autocrat who really just believes in his will being dominating everybody else. Napoleon at least had some goals, and so, right? But one of the things about this is that you never know whether you're in one of these positions where everything is turning out to be contradictory and therefore everything's falling apart until after the fact.
The Owl of Minerva, right, Pite, I guess, yeah.
Yeah, so, Roman historians look at all this, and there's a certain point where it's just now clear that the Western Empire is just not holding up. And around 476, Rome is sacked, and the guy sends, I forget his name now, sends the royal purple robes off to Constantinople, so we don't need these anymore. And there's still people around. It's not that everybody gives up immediately. There's still people around saying, no, the empire's still here. It's just in bad shape. We can get back to the old virtues and this and that. And so people moving on and so on. But of course now, 2,000 years later, they look back and say, that was it. That was the big change. So you don't really know about this. Hegel says in his introduction to the lectures on the philosophy of history, he said, people ask, are there any lessons we can learn from history? He said, the only lesson we have ever learned from history is that nobody ever learns anything from history.
Plus a change.
Right? Every occasion seems so new, right, and so full of contingencies. And so people are forever relying on, you might say, models from the past. So you look at, say, the United States foreign policy, right? So in the 60s, it sees Vietnam as a replay of Czechoslovakia in the 30s, right? We have to draw the line. It turns out that this wasn't Germany in the 30s, or, and so on. Turned out it was Vietnam. Then later on, there's Afghanistan. So we have to make sure that we don't get caught in Vietnam again. It turns out Afghanistan wasn't Vietnam anyway, right? So we got caught in that, and it turns out it's something else, and so on. People, there is a sense in which people do not and cannot learn from history, since every position always seems new.
Yet at the same time, the old continually seems to return in new guises.
That's right, yeah. Again, the image that Hegel has of history is you have these forms of life, and they develop, and so on. There's a certain point where the contradictions that were always there in that form of life become more explicit. It looks like there's still just a matter of some trade-offs, or we need to get the old virtues back or something. But eventually it falls apart under its own weight, and the people living in the rubble of that falling apart have to pick up the pieces that still work, throw out the stuff that doesn't work anymore, and they form a new form of life. But then the contradictions in that new form start to develop. And when that falls apart, the same thing. People living in the rubble of that have to throw out the pieces that don't work, pick up the pieces that do, and start something all over again.
Donald Trump is the end of history. I just don't think he has it. Maybe I'm wrong.
It's not the end of history. It may be the end of post-1945 history. That he may be, right?
That he may be.
The tensions and so on. Once again, we'd like to think what we're doing is we're balancing these things out. So, so the U.S. has accepted itself as the hegemon, right? And Western Europe has basically taken that on. Okay, so it has its advantages, you don't have to pay for defense and so on. And it was, NATO against the Soviet Union. So, one of the contradictions is that the U.S. is always in favor of a rule-based order, rule of law, which it then regularly breaks because it is, after all, the hegemon, the sovereign. It can do that when it wants to. right? So
It sets the rules.
it sets the rules, and it sets the rules, and it breaks the rules when it needs to break the rules. Now, is that a tension that we have just learned to live with, and by and large, it's helped, prosperity and this and that and so on? Or is it really an outright contradiction? And a huge amount of, say, scholarly activity has been, centered around, say, colonialism, neo-colonialism, and not everybody, is shared in this prosperity, and there's new problems with China. But in any event, the kind of the phenomenological aspect we're living in is certainly not the end of history. There's a wonderful little, by the way, does Hegel believe in the end of history? There's a wonderful little letter from Christian Martin Weise to Hegel in 1826. And Weise says, you're my hero, you're a great guy, and all this stuff. He said,
flattery gets you everywhere.
And he says, but, we were talking the other day, and I asked you, I said, will there be any new forms of Geist and so on that will appear that will not have anything really, be so much different from our current form? And he said, of course, right? There'll be forms that you and I can't even dream about, right? And it'll all, it'll go against my own system and so on and so on. And then Weise says, I think this is really interesting, but as I look over your work, it seems to me that you really are committed to the idea that you are at the end point. And I would like to talk with you about this some more. Now, we don't have Hegel's reply to Weise, because the odds are it was oral. They just got together and talked about it again. And Weise was either convinced or not convinced about what Hegel had to say, and that was that. But at least that's a little piece of historical, you might say, historical evidence that Hegel did not think that his system was the end of history. At least that's what he was telling Weise, according to Weise's account of what Hegel told.
Which of course he's commonly accused of saying that history, he was the full culmination of history, and that the end of history was things coming to an end. But now, one of the things I want to develop out of that, and it's related, is in terms of developing sort of balancing tensions and contradictions and interests, and trying to balance periods of history when forces and economies and powers become dominant and when they sort of recede. But I think in terms of in the sort of the latter parts of the Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel's talking about and you devote some time to this in the book, is the very obvious contradiction about the I and the we. So, you do this in the context of ethos and morality. So, I was wondering, could you perhaps fill that picture out a little bit, or speak to that?
Well, see, one of the things that is also, this is a kind of big picture view of what's going on in phenomenology, is that people had long recognized, right, that the Greek morality, so-called Greek morality and so on, especially as it worked out by people like Plato and Aristotle, was really very different from, say, Christian morality. And so what Hegel did, Hegel used two German terms that really mean the same thing, Sittlichkeit and Moralität.
Right.
Two very different types of approaches to what we could call very generally the ethical or the moral question. Think of Sittlichkeit as ethics, and think of Moralität as, of course, morality. Morality is essentially a rule book conception. It's Jewish, Christian, and Islamic. It's the religions of the book. The morality is a series of rules. They are commands. They've been issued by the appropriate authority.
Prescriptions.
Yeah, prescriptions, right. You must obey them, right? Now, then the question becomes if, morality is in fact really a set of rules, right? Is it therefore necessarily bound up with the idea of a divine legislator? Kant thought he solved that problem.
He sure did.
Kant thought he solved that problem. Right? We are autonomous. We give ourselves, we are the legislators of morality, or rather, we as rational beings are the legislators of morality. Now, Hegel, of course, is enamored of the Greeks. So, as with all things Hegel, right, he wants to bring what look like two opposites together. And so what he wants to claim is that the logic that's driving the kind of Aristotelian conception is a logic of attraction. It's a logic of a picture of a way of life, full of eudaimonia, happiness, well-being, flourishing, and so on, that operates within a certain type of small community, could really only be democratic, given its egalitarian views, and so on. And that's a logic of attraction. That's the kind of thing Kant talked about in the Critique of Judgment. Kant didn't think that this had anything to do with morality, or it really just was the beauty of nature and the beauty of works of art. And so what Hegel thought is that actually, this is a little out of phenomenology, but not much. The logic of the rulebook conception, the logic of obligation, really breaks down once we get to the Kantian and Fichtean view that we are self-authorizing. And this, if we're going to think of ourselves as free, which is one of the things that is driving the phenomenology, is we're coming to understand that all these rules that are coming from the outside on us are not working, and that we, in fact, somehow behind the scenes have been making up these rules for ourselves. And does that lead us into something like the path of despair, where we really think there really isn't anything right or wrong? We're not obligated to do anything here. Part of Jacobi's thread about modern philosophy leading to nihilism, that this is all empty. Right? Ultimately, it gets so abstract and so on, right, that we really can't make any sense of what rules are binding on us and what aren't. In order to solve that problem, we need to go back to the Aristotelian view of a form of life now that is attractive. So thus, after the phenomenology, after much batting around this and all this 1801 to 1807 to 1812 period, right, he comes to the conclusion that you can give an account of kind of rule book conception of the rights that we have and the moral duties and so on in terms of a series of rules. Those turn out to be empty, and in fact to require a conception of the good, which we find attractive. And that's a very different way of arguing things and so on. So that leads to Sittlichkeit, ethical life, family, civil society, and the state. Take, for example, the family, right? Hegel thinks family is a good example of ethical life, right? It's not so much that there's a system of rules, there's a system of the way in which you have spouses joining together, their children, they're people of different, children are dependent beings, right? They're not autonomous beings, certainly yet, though they're on their way here, and they certainly act as if they are sometimes.
Oh, yeah, I can attest to that, Terry, yeah. I got a 6-month-old.
Right. And nonetheless, the question is, kind of a question about, say, marriage and family is, what kind of life are we looking for? Now, Hegel argued that there had to be room for divorce. And divorce, he thought, was a form of ethical failure, not moral failure. Is fundamentally the problem of heart is not, you broke your promise, the moral question, but we, or I, or you, or both of us have failed to be the people that we set out to be.
Yeah, we failed to live up to our prescriptions, the prescriptions that we set, perhaps.
And it was attractive. We were getting together, we were forming a unity. It's going to be this kind of thing where they're reproducing society, they're raising the kids to be independent on their own, and so on. And we failed. And that requires a different kind of emotional reaction to it, and so on. It's not guilt, right, that I broke the law, right? I promised, and now I broke the law. It's rather, I failed. And I can regret that failure. Right? I can be terribly bound up by it, and so on, without being guilty. So that's part of, that's just a good example of how Hegel thinks of this, right? This ethics and Sittlichkeit. On the phenomenology, he doesn't quite work that out. That is, he starts with Sittlichkeit, which looks like it's a perfectly adequate form of life. That is, everybody knows what they're doing. It's very attractive. Everybody has their own particular place, particular role to play. And there's Antigone.
Right. I was going to ask.
Then there's Antigone, right? This shouldn't be going on. Antigone's a woman, right? She has an absolute duty to obey Creon. She also has an absolute, unconditional duty to bury her brother. She can't do both. And she has an absolute duty not to make up her own mind about this. There is a right and a wrong way to do things.
Right. So this usually plays out as the state versus the individual, but you think it's a bit more complicated than that, yeah?
Well, yeah, much more complicated for Hegel. So Antigone, she's not just caught in a double bind; she's in a triple bind. Right? You have to do this, you have to do that. Those two are incompatible, and you absolutely must not make up your own mind about what to do about this, because that's not your purview. Well, this shows that the Greeks are, now starting to introduce this reflective element of individuality, so on. They've already got the idea of, the beautiful individuality, the heroes and so on that we have. But you can see that the cracks are appearing. What looked like a completely, harmonious whole is now starting to fall apart in this case. And it's always from the background of now Western culture from Hegel's point of view in 1807. This looks as if it's kind of the golden age, something we've lost. This is, by the way, part of the way in which Hegel, Hölderlin, and Schelling, as their roommate, and when they were roommates in Tübingen, were really launching a kind of great revolution. They had come to the conclusion among the three of them that Europe was not essentially Christendom. Right? It was in fact Greek. The basis of the European culture is a pagan culture.
That's quite a radical thought in a sort of in a Christian Protestant country, I would have to say,
Yeah, well, the high school Hegel went to, right, was, basically Rome was, the model and so on. Christian Rome, right? We were all descendants of Christian Rome and so on and so on, right? He and Schelling and Hölderlin, right, in their, 18 and 19 years old, right? They're thinking, actually, no, right? And one of the advantages, by the way, they're both being, of all three being seminary students, right, was that they had to learn Greek. Greek, by and large, wasn't taught that much in German schools or German universities, right? But those three learned Greek, and they decided that there's something about the West that is not necessarily Christian. Now, Hegel's going to change his divine claim that the West developed a certain form of Christianity now, which is going to keep it in mind, right? So, phenomenology, you have Greece, it was wonderful, but it couldn't last. You can't recreate it. You can't go back again. And then the spirit alienates itself. See, it's actually laying down laws for itself that it understands as laws it doesn't lay down for itself. And that breaks down, when finally we reach the idea that, well, actually we can lay down the laws for ourselves after the revolution. We can become good, post-revolutionary Kantian Fichteans, right? Autonomous beings, authorizing ourselves in this way. That breaks down. And now we're ready for something else. And that's when you make the transition into the long chapter on religion.
Right, and then so the long chapter on religion is always sort of balanced as well with the idea that Hegel's, I suppose it's all tempered by Hegel's response to the French Revolution. I think he is a figure of the Enlightenment, Hegel. He's kind of post-Kantian. He's a figure of the Enlightenment for sure. But he's a kind of, a skeptical of the Enlightenment as well. And I think, obviously, the French Revolution plays a part in this. So that's probably one of the other contradictions that he's tried to resolve in the book, is to what degree is, the French Revolution as an avatar of freedom. It doesn't kind of live up to the prescriptions it set, really, does it? For Hegel, the French Revolution, it gives us freedom, but it's contentless freedom, or it's kind of too abstract. I was just teaching Edmund Burke the other day, and his famous comment. He says, I know it's obviously it was sort of, Burke is the sort of the paragon of reactionary thinking, but he did say, he was talking about human rights. He was like, I've never met a man or a human or a right. I've met a Frenchman, I've met an Italian, I've met an Englishman, and so on like that. But I've never met this abstract contentless thing. So that was, in some sense, that's Hegel was speaking to that, wasn't he? He was trying to, between his picture of sort of a questioning religion and a questioning reason, in some sense he was drawing together within the phenomenology of spirit, which I suppose is the ultimate contradiction. But I thought maybe perhaps you might like to speak to that, Terry.
This is a really complicated part of.
Sure.
Let me see if I can just. One of the problems of uncomplicating Hegel is you're often making it sound a little too easy.
Not possible with Hegel.
You really got to stop and go back and go over all the details. But at least what happens in the French Revolution, you get what he calls absolute freedom. Right? So I say in the French Revolution, now this is oversimplifying, right? But French Revolution, we are free. We make everything, right? There is no limit to what we can do, right? All this absolute freedom is empty, right? You say, so we are all completely self-legislating. We can do it all. Right? This is part of Hegel's critique of morality, right? Morality. That kind of just pure autonomy doesn't get you anywhere, right? So what, in fact, the French end up doing, right, is they end up adopting a very abstract principle of utility. Just, right, look at the whole, try to figure out what's necessary to do, what the rational thing to do is, right? So, by the way, here's another kind of fun aside, you might say, right? John Rawls's theory of justice, he's famous for having said, right, that the basic mistake of utilitarianism is it does not take the differences between individuals seriously. And he gives a footnote. It's John Finley's Values, Minds, and Intentions. So you go look at Finley. He wrote a great little book in the early 60s, late 50s actually, on Hegel reinterpretation. But in any event, you go to Finley's book, right? And so you look at this section of the book where Finley says you have to take the differences between individuals seriously. Here. And Finley has a footnote and says, see, Phenomenology of Spirit, Absolute Freedom and Terror. So that little Hegelian point gets moved up through Finley, and Rawls takes it over, and so on and so on. Right? I want to say Rawls' idea that the revolution didn't take the differences between individuals seriously; it just excised the sick parts, as it were. But of course, it didn't have any criterion for determining what the sick parts were, except that whoever happened to be running the government at the time, which at that time was the Jacobins, they're the people who decide, and so on. That can't last. Now, the religion part, where is this? Well, turns out that, as Hegel will argue, right, that really what religion is about the idea that there are better and worse ways of living. It's about Sittlichkeit. That ultimately it makes a difference as to how you live. And that is a fundamental religious, you might say, insight. It develops historically over time to the point where it develops into Christianity, which has a doctrine of conscience in its Protestant form. And that's really now key to modern freedom. In the last analysis, each of us has a conscience. That is a sacrosanct place. That's where we're really having to determine in the heat of the moment, right, what it is I have to do. The problem about that is that that's kind of back at absolute freedom and terror. That also isn't very helpful. It needs more fleshing out. Right? And so conscience can only really be fleshed out in terms of the determined institutions and practices. And then ultimately, that means religion as offering a set of doctrines, very concrete doctrines, right, about what your conscience should be telling you to do. Right? Those concrete doctrines, right, have to appeal not to theology, to some type of rational reconstruction of what these doctrines are and what they mean. And once you've made that step into theology, right, the next step is to philosophy, which is the judge about what is more rational and isn't.
That's where we come in.
Right, that's where we come in, right? And so Hegel has a view that philosophy has a really essential role to play. It isn't for everybody. Religion, as he puts it in his lectures on religion, 1827, right? Religion is for everyone. Philosophy isn't. Here, but philosophy is essential, right? That is, got to be a commitment to reason, working these things, and so on. A little optimistic, you might say, on Hegel's part, but that's where that comes in. So what happens in the French Revolution is you get an empty doctrine of absolute freedom. You can't just go back and say, well, let's just put the aristocrats back in their houses, we'll rebuild them all, we'll just go on like we did before, right? He even says at this point, Geist might have taken a different turn and just gone backwards. But it didn't, it really couldn't. So it really had to go forward. And then it had to now, once again, to use my metaphor, it had to look at the rubble it had created. Put off the parts that don't work, keep the parts that do, right? What you got is then, right, the French under Napoleon, right, what you now got. You keep all the, the rights and so on that have been gained in the revolutionary doctrine, right? All the idea of property rights and all this other kind of stuff. Get the commitment to liberty and equality. You get a very rational scientific way of looking at things. You start establishing these ground codes, right, for engineering and this and that and so on, so on, so on here. Right? And this is really the spirit of the revolution in that case.
Right. Now, I think that's a perfect point to ask my next question. And I'm going to try. I want to talk about sort of the latter part of the book, but that's in terms of the spirit of the revolution. Then that takes us to the question of Geist itself, as it's coming into a more mature, more complex, more variegated expression towards the end of the Phenomenology of Spirit. And Geist is then reason, not in an abstract form, but its reason is in sort of concrete form. In some sense, I think that's essentially the consequence of his remarks on religion and his remarks on the French Revolution. That is sort of, in some sense, that's it is making actualized of reason in a very, very concrete way. The main way to make that Geist concrete is, it seems, within the picture of freedom, and Hegel has a very peculiar understanding of freedom. So freedom is not a question of determinism, or at least not fully a question of determinism, or it's not a question of sort of voluntary sort of self-legislation, but he's trying to offer a very thick understanding of what freedom is. Freedom is to be sort of embedded in institutions and sort of social practices and our material life. So I was wondering, could you perhaps talk to that, Terry?
Yeah. And one is, Hegel does have a very complex and variegated idea of freedom. Once again, it's good to kind of, I think, clear things out a bit and see. He had a little, in his lectures in the philosophy of religion, he had a little phrase that he would like to use. Hegel was very good, I think, at giving students little headlines, right? So realizing they didn't necessarily follow all the particular details, right? But the headline was, History moves from one is free, the emperor, the chieftain, and so on, to some are free, aristocratic males, to the modern world where all are free. Right? There is no one who by nature isn't to be considered free. He also says that you are not free unless you know that you're free. If you don't know you're free, you are not free. Now, one of the features of the pre-modern world is that we are always think that we are being guided by, we, or at least a small group, most of us, right, think we're being guided by rules, principles, dictates, and so on that are coming from outside ourselves here. And that, in fact, we do not have the knowledge to give ourselves, right, our own principles. Think of, Hegel doesn't use really the term that Kant uses, right, to talk about freedom. What Kant calls it self-legislation, right? That's, again, morality. Hegel uses the term Selbstbestimmung more often, self-determination, determining yourself. To the extent that somebody else is in charge of the kinds of decisions you make about your own ethical life, about what it is to lead your own life, you are not free. And if you don't realize that that's the case, right, you're certainly not free. To the extent that you think, I have to listen to the divine voice, or I have to listen to what the emperor says, or I have to listen to, I am not free. I become free when I realize that I actually, right, there actually isn't any rational basis for having these things come from the outside. But then once again, you're, say, back at the French Revolution, I say, oh, so I'm free. I don't have to listen to any external voice as to how it is that I think about my, so on. Now, by the way, just from the point, for Hegel, this isn't necessarily technical knowledge that we're talking about. We're talking about ethical knowledge, the knowledge of how it is, what it is to lead your own life. And Hegel thinks that ultimately, each of us is in a position to make that decision for ourselves. Yeah. And that the modern world is one in which we are called on. This is the importance of Christianity and its appeal to conscience. But in the last analysis, right, the Protestant Christian, right, realizes that they are the final court of appeal. Right. It's also empty. It's also an empty court of appeal unless it's filled out by something else. So that freedom in this case, right, is going to rely on now a heavy sense that there is a better and worse way of doing things. And I am called upon to really figure that out for myself about what that is. So it's not purely subjective in the sense that anything I can do is okay. It's not completely objective in the sense that it is out there written in the stars, right, and so on, what it is I'm supposed to do. Those two have to come together. That's what conscience does. And the modern world has as its task the creation of a set of institutions and practices that will give us the proper anchor, right, so that we can make those decisions for ourselves. Here. Now, again, going back to the family, right? So, in the family, right, there's an attractive form of life there. There's a way in which you love, sex, child rearing, right, careers. And with Hegel, unlike a lot of the way philosophers talk about, say, ethics, right, there's actually a developmental story. There's you in your 20s, you in your 30s, you in your 40s, you in your 50s, 60s, 70s, and so on. Right? There's an arc of life there. And there are things that are appropriate at different ages and not appropriate at other ages, and so on. But that nonetheless, right, there's decisions you have to make, so you might say, there are now 1,000 novels about this in our contemporary life, but at what point does the marriage break up? At what point do you say, right, this just isn't going to work, right? And that's, again, not a matter of technical knowledge. It is a way of admitting, you might say that this has failed, right? Particular project. And it's failed not for, say, technical reasons. Technical reasons, you and I decided we've got to build a better mousetrap, and we realize that all the metals we bought are the wrong kind. Right? It's just not going to work, right? This is, ethical knowledge. It's a different form of knowledge. This is at least knowledge, and so on. It's the knowledge of what it is to be a self-conscious life. Here, and that's that. What does it mean to be a self-conscious life? Something Heidegger will later pick up in a transformed way about what does it mean. Right? Dasein is the entity for whom its being is a question.
Right.
This is also there at work in Hegel. By the way, I think Heidegger realizes this in his 1929 lectures after he's denied that Hegel has this conception. In 1929, he says, oh, Actually, he does.
Yeah, he did that Heidegger a lot, I think. Yeah, he did with Kierkegaard as well, didn't he? Yeah.
And so anyway, so that's one of the things about freedom, right? So there's a way in which you might say Hegel's freedom is really, kind of pretty simple, which is the question, who's making the rules, me or something else? Yeah. About how I am best to live my life. And I'm free when, I'm making rules. Okay. Objection. Yeah, all those objections are true. I need institutions, need practices, need all this background, right? And those institutions and practices have to show themselves to be rational. Here, that's one of the features, again, of the modern world. It's not, isn't the way God has just inspired it or anything like that. It is for us to determine that our institutions are rational. If they're not, eventually they will crack apart. The trade-offs that we're making may turn out to be just contradictions.
So the picture of freedom, then, as you were talking there, I was just thinking that it's freedom is embedded. It's sort of a thick description of freedom. It's institutional, it's material, and social practices. And sort of to borrow the Heideggerian formulation, freedom then is in question for us, and is something we set. So is he talking about a type of, so where Kant talks about sort of self-direction or self-legislation, sort of, autonomous, self-legislating being is what gives myself the moral law. Is Hegel moving to an idea of sort of collective legislation, or where the individual contributes to that sort of collective legislation? Is that an accurate way of putting it, Terry, perhaps, or am I missing out something there?
I mean, this is difficult to work out in any kind of short and easy form. But basically, it's a collective legislation about how we're going to live our life together and so on. And that this collective legislation is driven, though, by an overall commitment to the idea that we are to be free. And therefore, we have a very abstract, at that stated in that way, right, picture, right? We have an abstract way of thinking about what it is that is we are trying to achieve together here. And we can only achieve that together. Right? I cannot be free, really, say, in a completely anarchic world here. At that point, it's not Hegel we turn to, it's Hobbes in an anarchic world. But if we've got the institutions that can maintain that at least minimal sense of order, then we also want them to be the kind that will actually make us capable of being free.
Okay, so Terry, I'm conscious of time. Like, you've been very generous with your time, so I'll just have like two more questions. I think one sort of serious one and one slightly silly one, and I'll end on a silly one. But the conclusion of the Phenomenology of Spirit, then Hegel talks about the absolute, and we kind of end up back at the beginning, right? So I thought maybe I'd give you the opportunity to try and explain what Hegel means by the absolute. And now, as I'm saying it, Terry, I realise I'm just asking you to explain all of Hegel, which you've been doing for the last hour. But just in the context of the book itself, what is happening in that concluding section to the Phenomenology of Spirit?
Well, the concluding section of Phenomenology of Spirit, right? He says, it's very striking. He says, we're looking back at history, which is all contingent. History could have gone any which different directions. Given the direction it's gone in, though, we have discovered a kind of logic that's going on about people becoming more conscious about what they're doing. They're giving different answers to what it means to be a self-conscious life. They've come now to this very modern revolutionary break, right? This turns out to have to involve a large part of taking over some parts of the past and moving forward and so on and so on. And that outside of that, right, there is nothing. The world is all that is the case, as Wittgenstein said. And that world is a world in which the religious sentiment that some lives are better than not better than other lives, but there has to be a truth about the idea that it is better to live one way rather than another. Right? Better to live with ties of friendship than alone and solitary. Right? So on and so on here. But that all has to be worked out very concretely, right? Better to have, better to have a prosperous, thriving economy in which people can be free and think that they're really being able to exercise their own interests and so on and so on. Also being guided by collective legislation, right, that is keeping everybody's interests at heart. That's why he says, at the end of this, all right, if we didn't have that, right? And he says, as he talks about Geist as being led to its own Golgotha now, right? The Schädelstätte, right? The place of skulls where Jesus was crucified, right? But if Geist were just to stop there, right? At the end of the phenomenology, right? Which turns out to be rather abstract. You might say at the end of the phenomenology says, we're free, right? Hey, and great, and so, but, what do we do now? It looks like there might not be an answer. Okay. Because if that were the case, right, then Geist would be lifeless and alone. But then it looks, it sees into this chalices, foaming up, sparkling wine being poured into the chalice, right? And so it sees its own infinity, right? So you see that this infinity, right, is there, right, and so on. But now it is really up to us in this particular regard. It's up to us as concrete embodied beings, living in the environment we live in, right, and so on. Okay, the climate we live in. So, if we just stop there, we'd be lifeless and alone. So, right. First of all, we'd be lifeless. And it turns out that this kind of philosophy, if it just did that, would just be a kind of isolated academic enterprise with no real grip on the rest of life.
Wouldn't recommend that to anyone, Terry, no.
And it would also be alone. I mean, it wouldn't be talking to anybody. It would be talking to a few other people that are engaged in that kind of thing and so on, right? This has to take in, the idea is this has to take in everything, right? This is a book that it turns out we all need. And that foaming forth, and now it knows what it needs to do. It's going to step forward into the idea of, what is it to be free and what is it to claim to live? We're going to make claims about nature and this and that and so on. Hegel spends the next 25 years trying to work that out.
So it's like the absolute is it's like the endlessly fascinating process of understanding ourselves and others.
Well, the absolute is the world, beyond which, so there's a denial of there's a denial that there's a transcendent God. God is not outside the world.
Slightly controversial, Terry, that.
Right? I mean, Hegel is true to his Spinozistic roots, right? But one of the other things that, he and Hölderlin and Schelling used to do when they would use the Greek phrase hen kai pan, the one and all, which is the Spinozistic phrase, right? That there's just the one and all, there's just the world. Outside the world, there are no transcendent things. So God is in the world, right, and so on. God is the divine structure of the world. And in his lectures on this, right, Hegel always said, by the way, so when you look at the Gospel of John, right, the Gospel of John is, in the beginning was the Logos. And the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God, and the Logos became flesh. There is an intelligible, rational structure to the world. That's the divine element, right? Is that Christianity still? Well, a lot of people think, no, that's just not Christianity anymore, right? Whatever else is the case, Hegel's just wrong or duplicitous or something when he claims this is Christianity. It's
a different podcast.
A different podcast.
Yeah. So my last question, Terry, and I mean, you must have thought of this in your career, like you've written tons of books on Hegel, you've written the blooming biography of Hegel. If you could ask Hegel one question about the phenomenology of spirit, or even if you could ask Hegel one question, what would it be?
Let's say, give me a question. So Hegel, let me ask you the question which always gets asked. What exactly is this absolute? And right now, I understand your own specific terminology for this. Drop your terminology and tell me what it is.
And so says every reader of the Phenomenology of Spirit ever. Thank you so much, Terry. That was fantastic.
Okay.